Let's go ahead and shift our attention to the aggregate supply curve now. And this is going to show the real GDP that firms will produce at varying price levels. So here, in terms of the aggregate supply curve, we need to take a look at a time differentiation because they detail two different things. We take a look at a short-run aggregate supply curve and also a long-run aggregate supply curve. And like the names imply, they just tell us exactly what's happening in the short run or happening in the long run. The easier out of these two aggregate supply curve is going to be the one in the long run. So we're going to go ahead and detail all the ins and outs and facets of the long run aggregate supply curve first. So here, the long run aggregate supply curve is going to be vertical, and it's going to be vertical at full employment. So this is one of the unusual cases where our supply curves doesn't actually take a upward sloping line. It's actually going to be vertical. And the long-run aggregate supply curve incorporates the approach of classical economic analysis, which assumes that all variables are adjustable in the long run. So the long-run aggregate supply curve is exactly where our economy should be converging to in the long run over a long time period. So prices, wages, interest rates, every single macroeconomic variable that we can think about is going to be seen as adjustable, or it's going to be seen as flexible in the long run. In the long run, as we've already said, the economy will gravitate towards full employment. So the long run aggregate supply curve looks a little bit something like this. It's exactly like what we sort of laid out right here. We can go ahead, we have a curve such as this. We have the price level on the vertical axis. We have output, GDP, on the horizontal axis. And we can simply say, hey, the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical. LRAS, we're going to denote it for shorthand, and it's going to be Q star at this vertical long run aggregate supply curve. So we can consider this to be LRAS 0, just to start us off right here. So here, this Q star is basically telling us what our full employment GDP level is going to be, our potential GDP, we can also call it. So when we're operating at the natural rate of unemployment, when cyclical unemployment is equal to 0, this is exactly what our Q star level is going to be. So the economy should always be converging to this line right here in the long run. And there are a few things that are going to determine exactly where the LRAS curve is going to be for any particular country that we go ahead and take a look at. So the position of the LRAS depends on the economy's capacity, such as the amount of available resources, the quality of the labor force, the available technology. So with all of these, if we have more resources, if we have a better qualified labor force, if we have better technology, it just tells us that we're going to be able to produce more goods, more services, so our potential or full employment GDP should also be higher. And as we said, full employment occurs at the natural rate of unemployment. So here, when we consider this, we can say that this country probably doesn't have a lot of resources, it probably doesn't have a lot of technology, because the Q star level is pretty close to the origin right here. But can the country expand its LRAS? Can it sort of improve or expand the amount of full employment GDP it might have? And the answer is yeah, obviously. So what are a few things that can shift our LRAS curve over to the right as such? And this is going to be, not surprisingly, the things that we see right here. So it's going to depend on resources, the labor force quality, and the amount of technology that we have. So if we actually have the discovery of new resources, so if there's more than one factor of production that we're able to sort of exploit and use, if there are improvements in the quality of the labor force, so getting more education, more experience, if there's more technological improvements in automation, if there's some type of more digitalization in terms of some type of production process or methodology, and if we have freer international trade and more international investment, these are all things that are going to contribute to the LRAS shifting over to the right. So positive shocks to all of these right here. We're going to be shifting our LRAS curve over to the right, indicating that our Q star level has increased. So here we can say, hey, we go from LRAS 0 to LRAS 1. And what do we notice? We notice that Q star has gotten bigger. So we can say Q0, Q1. And because Q1 is further away from the origin, we notice that, hey, our natural rate of unemployment, our full employment GDP level right here, our potential GDP is much higher than before. We're going to be able to produce more goods and more services when all these sort of shocks occur. One thing to note, however, is that these shifts of the LRAS curve correspond to full employment, correspond to output at full employment, and they do take time to change. So they don't happen instantaneously. They don't even occur over a period of a year. These are things that can take decades or even several decades to sort of unfold. So here, this is exactly where we think about the things in the long term. However, in any one case, at any given moment in time, we don't necessarily always need to be on this LRAS curve. We may not necessarily be at our long run or full employment level here and right now. So there are a few things that we want to note as we talk about this LRAS. So that's kind of ugly. So let me draw this again. So there are a few ins and outs of this LRAS curve that we should be talking about before we move on to the short run. So here we have the price level. Once again, we have our GDP, and suppose that our LRAS curve is as such, LRAS. And we know that at Q star, this is denoted as our full employment GDP. Full employment GDP. I'll put this down here. Full employment GDP. So this is exactly where the economy should be converging to in the very long run, this Q star level. But in the short run, we may not always be at this Q star. We may be a little bit below it. We may be a little bit above it. There are always going to be some short run fluctuations along this long run equilibrium or this long run aggregate supply curve. So what do you think is happening within the economy if we're going to be below the Q star? So we're at a GDP level that is less than Q star, full employment GDP. In this instance, the economy should be doing poorly. It's in the sort of downturn or it's in some type of recession because our Q level, our GDP level, our current GDP level is not up to par with the full employment GDP level. So anytime we are below Q star, we have some type of unemployment, or we're in recession, And this is perfectly fine because it's a perfectly normal part of the business cycle. It just says that, hey, our current economic situation isn't as great as it can be, but we are in a recession right now because our GDP level is less than Q star. What happens in the opposite case, however? What happens if our current GDP is actually greater than Q star? And this is exactly where we have the opposite situation where the economy is considered to be in some type of boom. So the economy is actually doing very, very well. We might be overheating just a little bit, but we do have some type of boom and we have less than the natural rate of unemployment or less than the natural rate of unemployment. So there are a few scenarios or situations that we can find ourselves in based on the graph that we sort of brought up. We could be exactly at our long run equilibrium at Q star. That's a situation we can find ourselves in. We could be operating below Q star, indicating that the economy is in some type of recession, or we can be operating above Q star, which indicates the economy is overheating. We're in some type of boom. So in all three of these particular cases, in order to see where we are currently, that's exactly where we need to bring in the short run aggregate supply curve, and that will tell us where the economy is operating currently. Remember, with the long run aggregate supply curve, this tells us exactly where we should be converging to in the long run. So one thing to note about this long run aggregate supply curve, even though we can shift it over to the right if we have some type of positive shocks, if we have some type of negative shocks, we can shift it over to the left, indicating that something bad is happening within the economy. We rarely shift the LRAS curve unless we are explicitly told to do so. So anytime we're going to be talking about these short-run fluctuations and shifts of our equilibrium, we typically shift the aggregate demand and the short-run aggregate supply curves. So something to be a little bit aware about. With our long-run aggregate supply curve, we typically say that, hey, this is going to be constant, at least in our particular analyses in this particular chapter. We're going to say that this is currently going to be fixed and where we should be converging to in the long run. And unless we are explicitly told to do so, we rarely shift this LRAS curve. I think in the vast, maybe 99% of cases or examples that I think about that I'm going to do, we rarely shift this LRAS curve. We typically only shift the aggregate demand or the short run aggregate supply curve. So keep that in the back of your mind as we're going to bring up our final piece of the puzzle in order to see where our macroeconomic equilibrium is going to lie. So here, the long run aggregate supply curve in a nutshell, it is vertical. It is vertical at our full employment GDP level, and it is exactly where the economy should be converging to in the long run. I'll see you guys with the short run aggregate supply curve next.